Welcome back to The Pinnacle Perspective, the series where we deconstruct the invisible architectures of peak performance. I'm your host, Sarah. Today, we are confronting an epidemic that plagues the highest echelons of corporate leadership, artistic expression, and entrepreneurial ventures. It is a paradox that haunts us. Why do we freeze at the precise moment we need to innovate? Why does success often bring paralysis instead of liberation? We call it burnout, imposter syndrome, or the dreaded creative block, but I argue it is a fundamental crisis of operational trust. To dissect this crisis, I have invited a man who is, without exaggeration, the secret weapon behind the innovation labs of Silicon Valley giants, the turnaround strategies of ailing Fortune 500s, and the creative resurrection of Grammy-winning artists. He is a Swedish-American organizational psychologist who has spent 20 years on the front lines of human cognition, merging the rigor of neuroscience with the ancient wisdom of Stoic philosophy. Please welcome the architect of creative resilience, the man who teaches executives how to dance with chaos, Mr. Eric Lindström. Eric, thank you for crossing the Atlantic to join us. I have to say, your client list reads like a who's who of global innovators, yet your methodology remains fiercely anti-guru. You reject quick fixes. You despise toxic positivity. So for our listeners who are facing a blank page, a stalled product launch, or a withering performance review, why should they trust a process that demands so much discipline rather than a simple motivational pep talk?
Sarah, that is precisely the right question to start with. Motivation is a weather system. It comes and goes with the barometric pressure of our emotions. What I offer is structural engineering. I am not here to inflate your ego. I am here to fortify your nervous system.
Let us lay the groundwork for our audience. You just mentioned the nervous system. In your book, you define creative confidence not as a feeling, but as a measurable metric. Can you articulate that definition for us?
I define it as the courage to initiate action in the face of ambiguous uncertainty, coupled with the psychological agility to metabolize external feedback without collapsing your internal locus of identity. In layman's terms, it is the ability to throw a punch at a problem, and if the punch misses, to analyze why it missed without declaring that your arm is broken.
That is a visceral image, so it is inherently linked to our survival instincts.
Precisely. We must address the elephant in the room, the amygdala. Neurobiologically, your brain cannot distinguish between a predatory tiger and a hostile client. When you receive scathing criticism, your adrenal system floods with cortisol. The late philosopher Seneca, a Stoic, warned us 2,000 years ago, we suffer more often in imagination than in reality. Your creative paralysis is a phantom limb pain. You are reacting to a narrative you have constructed about your inadequacy, not to the actual objective reality of your skills.
That is incredibly liberating, but equally terrifying. If I am biologically wired to avoid this tiger, how do I override a million years of evolution?
By redefining the tiger. The German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche wrote, "You must have chaos within you to give birth to a dancing star." We must invite the chaos in. Think about the design firm IDEO. David Kelly, their founder, institutionalized the fail faster protocol. They don't fear the ugly prototype, they celebrate it. Why? Because they know the gap between the masterpiece in your mind and the disaster on the paper is the only space where mastery is forged. Sarah, if you avoid the disaster, you will never stumble upon the masterpiece. It is a mathematical certainty.
You mentioned the internal locus of identity. This brings me to the ubiquitous shadow over modern professionals, imposter syndrome. I spoke to a CEO last week who admitted he feels like a fraud daily. How do you counsel a titan of industry who feels like a child in a trench coat?
By quoting Maya Angelou. She once confessed, "I run from the phone when it rings, thinking it's someone who has discovered I know nothing." If the poetic giant felt that way, Sarah, it tells us that the feeling is not correlated with competence. It is correlated with stakes. The higher the stakes, the louder the critic.
So we can't silence it?
We must renegotiate its job description. Neuroscience points to the default mode network, DMN, the part of your brain that activates during idle rumination. It links directly to self-referential negativity. To counter this, I teach a technique called cognitive distancing. It is the practice of becoming the scientist of your own mind.
Give our audience a practical handle on this.
Certainly. Imagine you are a researcher studying a subject named Sarah. When Sarah draws a line and hates it, the untrained mind says, "I am a terrible designer." The trained mind says, "I notice that my cognitive apparatus is labeling this particular line as unsatisfactory." That 3-millisecond pause, that fissure between the observer and the thinker, is where your freedom resides.
So we are separating the data from the verdict.
Exactly. And let's look at Pixar for a real-world application. They have a rule called plussing. When a director critiques a storyboard, they are strictly forbidden from saying, "I don't like this." They must say, "What if we tried it this way?" They add a plus to the idea. They attack the problem, not the person. The psychologist Adam Grant supports this, stating that procrastination is merely a coping mechanism for anxiety. To defeat it, you must separate the conception from the evaluation.
Let's get tactical, Eric. Our audience is full of busy executives and creatives. What is the first exercise you prescribe to rebuild this operational trust from the ground up?
The shitty first draft. I borrow this from the writer Anne Lamott. She argues that the writer's job is not to produce gold, it is to get the clay on the table. My prescription is the 5-minute deluge. Every morning, before checking emails, before your coffee cools, you must produce something. Write 50 words of gibberish, draw a geometrically absurd shape, compose a haiku about your toaster.
A haiku about a toaster? That sounds almost insultingly juvenile. How does that translate to high-stakes corporate strategy?
Because it deactivates the threat response. You wouldn't deadlift 500 pounds without a warm-up. This is your neural warm-up. It signals to your brain, we are in a sandbox, not a battlefield. The legendary Ernest Hemingway stated, "All first drafts are shit." He didn't mean it as a defeat, he meant it as a permission slip. When you accept the initial output as raw, unpolished clay, the pressure to perform evaporates.
So we produce chaos. But how do we bridge the gap between chaos and the final, polished deliverable?
Through the harvesting eye. You don't review the deluge immediately, you put it in a drawer. After a week, you review the 7 outputs. You will be shocked to find one line, one shape, or one texture that has latent potential. Consider Einstein. He didn't just think mathematically, he played the violin when stuck on a physics problem. He didn't play to become a musician, he played to loosen the neural pathways. He famously said, "Imagination is more important than knowledge." Your 5-minute ritual feeds the imagination, starving the critical knowledge base that is currently strangling you.
That is a powerful ritual. But I want to pivot to the occupational hazard that destroys more careers than lack of talent, the inability to metabolize feedback. A client says, "This is boring," and the creative spirals into depression. What is the antidote?
This is the critical threshold, Sarah. You must master epistemic reframing. The French philosopher Michel de Montaigne wrote, "My life has been filled with terrible misfortunes, most of which never happened." The critique, "This is boring," is not a biological attack. It is an interpretive statement about the client's subjective perception.
How does one distinguish between a valid critique and a destructive one?
I use the data versus verdict matrix. In the left column, you write the feedback as data. For example, client noted the color palette is too warm. In the right column, you write the perceived verdict. For example, client thinks I have no taste. Now you rationally challenge the verdict. Is there objective truth in the data? Yes. Is it objectively bad? No. It is a mismatch of association.
So we take the sting out by objectifying it.
Precisely. Let me give you a historical case. When Steve Jobs returned to Apple, he was ruthlessly abrasive. He would tell designers an idea was bullshit. But Johnny Ive, his legendary design partner, survived and thrived. Why? Because Ive distinguished between the message and the messenger's delivery. Ive would ask, "Why is it bullshit? What is the underlying principle you are objecting to? He transformed the attack into a hypothesis.
That requires immense self-regulation.
It requires the ultimate philosophical anchor. Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist who survived the Holocaust, wrote in Man's Search for Meaning, "Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. Insert a strategic delay between the shock of the criticism and your emotional reaction. Ask a Stoic question. What is within my control here? You control your execution and your communication. You do not control the client's subjective taste. Once you divide the problem into the controllable and the uncontrollable, you reclaim your power instantaneously."
We have covered the morning ritual and the feedback filter, but the final question our audience always asks is, how do I sustain this? How do I keep the well from running dry?
This is the economics of input. You cannot extract what you have not deposited. The writer Stephen Pressfield calls it resistance. To defeat resistance, you must become a voracious yet disciplined consumer of diverse stimuli. The biophysicist Stuart Kauffman coined the term the adjacent possible. It posits that the future evolution of any system is always limited by the nearest opportunities currently available.
In plain English,
If you only look at design blogs, your next idea will be a derivative of design blogs. If you look at architecture, biology, jazz improvisation, and culinary plating, your adjacent possible expands exponentially. I prescribe the 30-minute deep look. Not social media scrolling, that is sugar. I mean deep observation. Study the structural integrity of a spider's web. Analyze the rhythm of a Miles Davis trumpet solo. Read a poem by Rumi.
don't we risk becoming esoteric and losing commercial relevance?
Quite the opposite. Consider Zaha Hadid, the late architect. She wasn't inspired by buildings. She was inspired by the Russian avant-garde painter Malevich and the fluid geometry of melting glaciers. She looked at paintings and ice formations to design the Heydar Aliyev Center. She didn't copy the ice, she copied the principle of liquid fluidity. Her confidence came from trusting her unique combinatorial matrix. No one else had her collection of inputs. Therefore, no one else could produce her outputs. That is the ultimate competitive moat.
Eric, we are coming to the end of our time. We have covered neurology, stoicism, corporate war stories, and artistic inspiration. If you were to leave our audience with one single immutable law of creative survival, what would it be?
Aristotle said, "We are what we repeatedly do." Excellence, then, is not an act but a habit. The techniques we discussed today, the 5-minute deluge, the data versus verdict matrix, the 30-minute deep look, are not emergency interventions. They are the structural scaffolding of a new operating system. Your creative confidence will not be restored by one magnificent project. It will be built micron by micron by the ritual of showing up even when you feel utterly inadequate.
So, we must divorce our ego from the outcome and marry our discipline to the process?
You have summarized 90 minutes of dense philosophy in one perfect sentence. The ancient Greeks called it techne, craftsmanship rooted in principle, not just skill. When you focus on the techne, praise and criticism become mere data on the wind. You will stop striving to be safe because you will understand that safety implies stagnation, and you have chosen the more arduous, more rewarding path of dynamic, perpetual growth.
Eric Lindström, you have dismantled our anxiety and handed us a blueprint for reconstruction. It has been an absolute privilege.
The privilege is mine, Sarah. Remember, the dancing star is waiting to be born. Walk into the chaos.
That wraps up today's episode. Take the blueprint, build your rituals, and trust the process. Until next time, stay curious and stay disciplined.